From London, I'm Rochelle Travers, and this is The Standard. Fears are growing over the potential of a full-scale war after Israel hit southern Lebanon with its most intense airstrikes in nearly a year. Israel's military said jets struck hundreds of multiple rocket launcher barrels in southern Lebanon on Thursday that were set to be fired immediately towards Israel. Lebanon's state news agency said the bombardment included more than 52 strikes after 9 p.m. The intense barrage follows two deadly attacks targeting Lebanese militants with exploding pagers and walkie-talkies, killing 37 people, including 2 children, and wounding more than 3,000 others. I'm now joined by our defence editor, Robert Fox. Robert, overnight Israel has carried out its most intense airstrikes on southern Lebanon in nearly a year. Can you give us an idea of the scale of this latest attack and its impact?
Well, it's been huge, over 100 strikes. It's not on 100 targets necessarily, but we know what the targets are. First of all, at the beginning of the week, they have done a big attack on communications of Hezbollah, which is seen, by the way, as a bigger enemy in terms of military power than Hamas. And Netanyahu seems to have persuaded enough of his cabinet that this has to be tackled, so that they've done the communications by blowing up the pagers and then the walkie-talkies the following day. And now it's the rockets, and they fear the rockets the most. And in a way, Hezbollah has been a victim of its own propaganda, because they have boasted that since the last war, outright war, which was in 2006, they have upped their arsenal both in quality and in quantity, and they have over 150,000 rockets of different calibers, and they can strike any city in Israel. And that's generally taken to be true. So overnight, what have they been doing? They've been getting at rocket launcher sites, and it seems that they have struck out at 30 of the key ones. It wouldn't only be that, it would be radar stations and it would be fire control positions.
As you touched on there, this all comes after Hezbollah and Iran vowed a crushing response to the pager and walkie-talkie attacks earlier this week. Could we be looking at things escalating to a full-scale war here?
Yes, but it's very difficult to see what it would be like. They've had a bad history in the past. Israel has been talking about going into southern Lebanon to eradicate the military threat from Hezbollah there, because they've been rocketing into northern Israel steadily ever since October the 8th, the day after the Gaza massacres in the settlements around Gaza. And this was business that even the more cautious of the Israel Defense Force commanders said would have to be dealt with. Now, they have been involved in operations in the past. These do not end well, but it does look as if Israel has opted for some kind of temporary occupation of a buffer zone, of a sanitized zone, as they put it, in South Lebanon, in order to get their citizens back into the northern towns and dwellings and farms of around the Golan Heights and up in the Panhandle, the very northern finger of Israel, from which between 60 and 70,000 civilians had to flee within weeks of the attack starting. And that has been Benjamin Netanyahu's pledge. That is the operational reality. That is, what is happening on the battlefield now. That is the for now. But the strategic aspect is, where does this take them? Is this going to be perpetual war with Hezbollah? And where does it take outright conflict with Iran, which is a key player then? Once you bring in Iran and Iran sponsorship, you go regional, because you involve the Houthis, you involve the various surrogates that they have in the Red Sea and beyond, going even into Somalia and Sudan.
Why has this situation escalated so much this week? What's been the catalyst?
It's been going on a long time. Now, this operation to plant explosives in the pagers and the walkie-talkies would have taken months. It's now quite clear from briefings that have got through via Israel to the CIA and the American intelligence hierarchy. It's not just the CIA, but it's the National Security Council, that it is clear that the company that made the pages, particularly, we know, was an Israeli front. These things were manufactured. They were not interfered with. They were manufactured with explosives in them. So these have been made surreptitiously by the Israelis. How they managed to persuade Hezbollah to order them to make a big bulk order of thousands of these things is very interesting. It's very cunning. And the leader, the charismatic leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, who spoke yesterday and swore vengeance, may have been the architect of all this, because some way back he said that Hezbollah commanders, operatives should not use mobile phones because they knew Israeli surveillance of mobile phones, of interference, was absolutely commonplace, paramount, and it was being done. And that was true, by the way. The Israelis are the most adept in the world at doing this. And so Nasrallah said, and it's on record, they should all opt for pagers. And that was it. And it was from there that the Israelis moved. We like to have the sort of the commonplace, it's actually a journalistic shorthand, and it's not quite true, that they think this was all the work of Mossad. I don't think it was at all. I think it's a much more interesting, really high-end cyber and guerrilla warfare expertise, contained by particularly the extraordinary unit with a very, very dull name called Military Unit 8200.
Let's go to the ads. Coming up in part 2, our defence editor Robert Fox explains where the latest developments leave the Western allies.
They're looking first of all at their own communication systems. Israel has shown itself as being the master of this, and they must be worrying, in the case of the UK and the US particularly, how much they're involved in all of this.
The Standard Podcast will be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Still with me is Robert Fox, the Standard's defence editor. Where does this all leave the Western allies? Are they looking at how they can de-escalate tensions?
They're looking first of all at their own communication systems. Israel has shown itself as being the master of this, and they must be worrying, in the case of the UK and the US particularly, how much they're involved in all of this. Because this is why America, did you notice very quickly, the administration of Joe Biden said very, very quickly, we're not involved in this. Because this goes back, do you remember I mentioned Military Unit 8200? They were involved in this Trojan horse, this worm called Stuxnet, which they got into the Iranian centrifuge for nuclear industry business very, very successfully. Now, the Americans certainly did know about that. I don't say that they were the progenitors of it, that they understood where it was going, what was being trialed. And I think that they turned to Israel for advice about this. And I know the Brits do too. Boris Johnson was fascinated by this world. One of the things that has to be said, and this is, I'm just talking about, what happens to the Allied states. They've got to think about the aspect of warfare shown by this, because in Israel, I've been at demonstrations of this where the military contractors can actually surveil and get into any commercial civilian mobile system, and they do. And they listen. And I was with a very distinguished correspondent fellow and colleague from the Daily Telegraph, Phil Johnston, who was a brilliant Home Affairs correspondent. He said, you could never do this in Britain because this is absolutely fundamental against British domestic legislation guaranteeing privacy. So this is this other aspect of the new war, the warfare that you can't see. And this is the thing we really do have to take on board. Right. That's the first thing. The second thing is, where do we stand? Where do we think? Where do we look now that it looks as if an outright operation across the border into Lebanon seems to be on the way? They've moved another division up. They've got 2 fully trained, fully prepared armored divisions, and we've seen this formidable air attack. Yes, they're going to war. Well, one of the saddest and most ominous things was just in the last 36 hours that Blinken's team, that's Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, the Foreign Minister of the USA, has said any idea that there can be a ceasefire deal in Gaza is off. So the hostages have been left where they are, however many there are, and they're only in double-digit numbers. In other words, below 100 in Gaza. That is the first thing. They have to expect a war. The ceasefire in Gaza is off. That's point 2. Point 3 is where Iran will take this. And Iran has taken a blow with this. Iran has been extending its activities in the Shiite militias, really getting a grip on government in Iraq. Things are on the way in Syria, where the Assad regime is weakening, and he himself is reported to be very ill. So what are they going to do there? They're stretched. They have made it pretty clear, while they're shouting revenge, they don't, as things stand, want an outright war with Israel for several reasons. That could go terribly wrong very, very quickly. There's no threat, or very little threat, of a nuclear exchange at this stage because they don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the nuclear reserve, thank goodness. But it does look very complex. So I would see Iran, yes, saying we're behind Hezbollah, and they will rearm and re-equip them with rockets. But the main effort will probably come way to the south with the Houthis, whom they have been providing with ever more sophisticated weapons and drones, really long-range drones and missiles that can go up to 1,000 kilometers. And they're going to tool up with that. They're going to make the Red Sea a no-go area. By the way, they're working with the Russians to build a port on the Red Sea, on the West Bank, on the Port Sudan, and that they're going to militarize that conflict. By that, they mean the Houthi Red Sea area even more. They could, if the worst comes to the worst, and that would be outright confrontation, they could close the Straits of Hormuz going into the Gulf, which would affect tanker traffic from that side of Saudi Arabia. So very, very big prospect. But what I'm seeing peculiarly is I think there is no overall strategic plan from Iran. Aging leadership, it's very similar to the old Soviet setup in the way that the military forces behave in Iran, particularly the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a sort of an entity, a sort of a private enterprise on its own, because they have their own factories, they do their own things, they even trade in drugs and organized crime. So what you do there is going to be very interesting. And of course, they have a very intelligent, a high intelligentsia in the population who are pretty restive. We are looking at the transfer of power from the present Ayatollah Khamenei, who's 84, I think, coming up to 85, and not particularly well. And how that goes is going to be particularly interesting. But if I can pull you back, do one more thing with Iran. Iran, where else is it active? Iran is a best friend of Vladimir Putin's Russia. And one of the big surprises about Ukraine, where things are very, very tough indeed, is but how much we're seeing more and more signs that Putin's military, which he has just expanded in number again, is becoming increasingly the client of Iran for key weaponry, for drones and for medium-range rockets, ballistic missiles, 200 of which they have just taken, the FAT 360, and how much they rely on artillery ammunition from North Korea. It's a very, very strange world. And do you think that the Western world can look at this by sitting on its hands and saying, oh, it's all too difficult. Really, we have to think we haven't got that much money. Let's not decide. Our indecision is final. I think it's no good. And I'm afraid that that was the impression that we got when Mr. Keir Starmer met Joe Biden. We had a 2.5-hour meeting, people looking very tired. By the way, Ms. Gray was there. Sue Gray was right next to the Prime Minister, seems to be his great consigliere on so many of these things. I wonder what her role is in how he faces this incredibly rich and worsening war scenario. They're going to have to do something. I predict within weeks there will be an emergency NATO summit, that they'll have to decide how they reinforce Ukraine to get it through the winter. And they will also have to decide what they do about the Middle East as it affects their own interests, like commercial shipping. But like Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu is on a war parameter, a war program. He lives, dies, and survives politically by continually going to war. And that is the heart of the problem.
You can read more from Robert Fox and the latest on the Middle East crisis on our website, standard.co.uk. And that's it from this episode. This podcast will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m.